September 14, 1944. The transport truck rattled along the dusty roads of southern Mississippi, carrying cargo that most Americans would never have imagined existed. 32 female German prisoners of war, captured during the final Allied push through France, sat in silence as pine trees blurred past the canvas-covered sides of the vehicle. Among them was 24-year-old Irmgard Richter, a former communications specialist from Dresden who clutched a small tin cup as if it were made of gold. It was the only possession she had managed to keep through her capture, transport across the Atlantic, and processing through multiple facilities. But it wasn't sentimentality that made her hold it so tightly. It was hunger. The women had been traveling for 3 days since leaving the processing center in New York. They had been fed during the journey simple meals of bread, cheese, and occasionally some kind of meat that Irmgard couldn't quite identify. But even these basic rations represented more food than most of them had seen regularly in the past 2 years. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They were prisoners, captured by the enemy, yet they were eating better than they had as free women serving the Reich. Irmgard's mind drifted back to the winter of 1943 in Dresden, when her daily ration had consisted of 200 grams of bread, a small portion of turnips, and a cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. Real coffee had become a memory, real meat a fantasy. She remembered watching her younger sister Margaret grow thinner each week, her cheekbones becoming more pronounced, her eyes seeming too large for her face. Across from Irmgard sat Brunhilde Schneider, a 31-year-old nurse from Leipzig. Hilda, as everyone called her, had served in a field hospital before her capture. She had seen what malnutrition did to soldiers, how wounds refused to heal when bodies lacked proper nutrition, how infections spread more easily among the malnourished. She had watched strong men waste away, not from their injuries, but from the simple absence of adequate food. Now she studied the other women in the truck with a practiced medical eye, noting the signs of chronic hunger that all of them carried. Hollow cheeks, thinning hair, the particular grayness of skin that came from years of insufficient protein and vitamins. The truck began to slow, and through the gap in the canvas, Irmgard could see buildings appearing. Camp Shelby, someone had told them during the journey, though the name meant nothing to any of the German women. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that in less than 2 hours they would encounter something that would fundamentally challenge everything they believed they understood about their captors, about America, and about what it meant to be a prisoner of war. They were about to discover that the real shock of captivity wasn't cruelty or deprivation. It was abundance. The gates of Camp Shelby opened to reveal a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, administrative buildings, and facilities that seemed impossibly well maintained compared to the bombed-out structures the women had left behind in Europe. Sergeant Leland Porter, a lean man in his late 30s from Biloxi, stood waiting as the truck came to a halt. He had been assigned to oversee the female prisoners, a duty he had initially questioned. Porter had 2 sons serving in the Pacific, and the idea of treating enemy soldiers with anything approaching kindness sat uneasily with him at first. But orders were orders, and the Geneva Convention was clear about the treatment of prisoners of war. The women climbed down from the truck, their movements stiff after days of travel. Irmgard noticed immediately how clean everything was, how the buildings stood straight and intact, how there were no signs of bombing damage or destruction. It was disorienting after years of living among ruins and rubble. Porter gestured for them to follow him, and the group moved in a loose formation toward a long, low building that sat at the center of the compound. As they approached, a smell reached them that made several women stop mid-step. It was the smell of cooking food, but not the thin vegetable soups or ersatz meals they had known. This was the rich, complex aroma of meat, of fresh bread, of foods they had almost forgotten existed. Adelheid Fischer, a quiet 29-year-old from Berlin who everyone called Heidi, grabbed Irmgard's arm. "Do you smell that?" she whispered in German, her voice trembling. Irmgard nodded, unable to speak. The smell was triggering memories of childhood, of Sunday dinners before the war, of a time when food was about pleasure rather than mere survival. Porter led them through the doors of the mess hall, and the women stood frozen at the entrance. The space was enormous, with long tables arranged in neat rows, but it was what lay beyond that stopped their breath. Through a serving window, they could see into the kitchen where American soldiers worked at massive stoves. Pots bubbled with soups and stews. Trays of what appeared to be fresh-baked rolls sat cooling on metal racks. Brunhilde moved forward slowly, as if in a dream. She had spent 2 years rationing medications, making impossible choices about who received treatment and who didn't, all because of shortages. Now she was looking at a kitchen that seemed to have no concept of scarcity. Porter noticed their reactions, but misread them as simple surprise at American facilities. He couldn't have known that what these women were experiencing wasn't surprise. It was the shock of encountering something they had been told didn't exist, something their own propaganda had insisted was a lie. American abundance wasn't propaganda. It was real, and it was about to fundamentally alter everything they thought they knew. The camp administrator had decided that the new arrivals should eat before being assigned to their barracks. It was standard procedure, ensuring prisoners had at least one decent meal after the long journey. What wasn't standard was the meal that had been prepared that particular September evening. The camp cook, a jovial man from New Orleans named Corporal Nash, had decided to use up a surplus of eggs before they spoiled. His solution was simple and thoroughly American: deviled eggs, dozens of them, arranged on large platters alongside the regular dinner of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. When the German women filed through the serving line, they received portions that would have fed a German family for 2 days. But it was when Irmgard reached the end of the line and saw the platters of deviled eggs that something inside her broke. The eggs were perfectly halved, the yolks whipped into a creamy yellow mixture and piped back into the whites, topped with a sprinkle of paprika. There were so many of them, arranged in neat rows, more eggs in one place than she had seen in 3 years. In Germany, a single egg was a treasure, rationed carefully, often saved for the sick or the very young. Her hands shook as she took one, then looked up at Corporal Nash with an expression he couldn't quite read. He smiled and gestured for her to take more. "Go ahead, miss. Plenty where those came from." Irmgard took another, then another, and suddenly she was crying. Not quiet tears, but deep, shuddering sobs that shook her thin frame. Brunhilde, standing behind her, saw the eggs and felt her own eyes filling. Within moments, several of the women were weeping openly as they took the deviled eggs, carefully placing them on their trays as if handling precious jewels. The American soldiers in the mess hall exchanged confused glances. Sergeant Porter stepped forward, concerned that something was wrong, that perhaps the women thought the food was poisoned or some kind of cruel trick. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice sharp with worry. Irmgard looked at him through her tears and tried to explain in her halting English. "Eggs," she managed. "So many eggs. In Germany we—" But she couldn't finish. How could she make him understand what it meant to see food treated so casually, served so abundantly, when back home people were starving? Porter looked at the deviled eggs, then back at the crying women, and something shifted in his understanding. These weren't hardened enemy soldiers. They were hungry people who had been living in a world of scarcity so severe that simple abundance moved them to tears. That night, unable to sleep in the clean barracks with its real mattresses and blankets, Irmgard lay awake, thinking about the deviled eggs. Her mind drifted back to Dresden, to the apartment on Pragerstrasse where she had lived with her mother and younger sister Margaret. It had been January of 1943 when the rations had been cut again, reducing their daily bread allowance to barely enough to sustain one person, let alone 3. Her mother, Helena, had worked in a textile factory that had been converted to producing military uniforms. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay barely covered their rent. Irmgard had been working as a communications specialist for the Wehrmacht, a job that had seemed important and patriotic when she first started. The position came with slightly better rations, a fact that probably saved their lives during those brutal winter months. But even with her supplementary rations, there was never enough. She remembered coming home each evening to find her mother had saved most of her own portion for Margaret, who at 16 was still growing and needed the nutrition more. Helena would insist she had eaten at the factory, but Irmgard knew it was a lie. She could see her mother growing thinner, moving more slowly, her hands shaking when she thought no one was watching. The worst part had been watching Margaret transform from a lively teenager into a listless shadow. Her sister had stopped menstruating, a common occurrence among malnourished young women that the doctors called war amenorrhea. Her hair began falling out in clumps. She couldn't concentrate on her studies at school and eventually stopped attending altogether because she lacked the energy to walk the 2 kilometers each way. Irmgard would sit with her in the evenings, both of them huddled under thin blankets, and Margaret would talk about the foods she remembered from before the war. Real butter on fresh bread, apfelstrudel with vanilla sauce, roasted pork with crackling skin. These memories became a kind of torture, a reminder of everything they had lost. The breaking point came in March when Margaret collapsed at home. The doctor, when he finally came, confirmed what they already knew: severe malnutrition complicated by vitamin deficiencies. He prescribed rest and better nutrition, recommendations so absurd under the circumstances that Irmgard had laughed bitterly after he left. Where were they supposed to find better nutrition when the ration cards barely provided subsistence? That night, Irmgard had made a decision. She would volunteer for overseas duty, any assignment that might come with better rations that she could somehow send home. The morning after the deviled egg incident, Irmgard approached Sergeant Porter with a request that surprised him. Through a combination of gestures and her limited English, she made it clear that she wanted to work in the kitchen. Porter was skeptical at first, wondering if this was some kind of sabotage attempt, but something about the earnestness in her eyes made him reconsider. The camp needed workers, and the Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to volunteer for labor. He agreed to let her work under supervision, assigning Corporal Nash to oversee her. Nash was a large man with an easy smile and a philosophy about food that bordered on religious conviction. He believed that good cooking could solve most of the world's problems, and he approached his role as camp cook with missionary zeal. When Irmgard reported for duty that first morning, he handed her an apron and pointed to a mountain of potatoes that needed peeling. She set to work immediately, her movements quick and efficient. What struck Nash was how carefully she worked, how she peeled the potatoes so thinly that almost no flesh was wasted. When she finished and he inspected her work, he was impressed by her precision. Over the following days, Irmgard became a fixture in the kitchen, arriving early and staying late. She watched everything with intense focus, studying how Nash prepared meals, how he measured ingredients, how casually he used items that would have been precious luxuries in Germany. The first time she saw him crack a dozen eggs into a bowl without even counting them, she had to look away. The waste disturbed her almost as much as the abundance amazed her. American soldiers would leave half-eaten meals on their trays, food that would have fed her family for days, simply scraped into garbage bins. One afternoon, Nash noticed Irmgard standing frozen in front of the large refrigerator unit, staring at its contents with an expression of disbelief. Inside were rows of milk bottles, blocks of butter, fresh vegetables, and cuts of meat. "Something wrong?" he asked. She turned to him, struggling to find the English words. "So much," she finally said, gesturing at the refrigerator. "How you have so much?" Nash scratched his head, not quite understanding the question. To him, this was just a normal supply for feeding a few hundred men. It had never occurred to him that what seemed ordinary to an American might appear miraculous to someone from a starving country. Irmgard began to understand something profound during those kitchen shifts. The abundance wasn't just about America being wealthy, it was about a fundamentally different relationship with food, with resources, with the basic necessities of life. Americans didn't hoard or ration or carefully measure every gram because they didn't have to. They had built a society where scarcity wasn't the default condition. This realization was almost harder to process than the hunger had been. It meant that everything she had been told about America being on the verge of collapse, about their people suffering, about their weakness, was a lie. Sergeant Leland Porter had been watching the German women carefully since their arrival, and what he observed troubled him in unexpected ways. These weren't the fanatical Nazi soldiers he had imagined. They were thin, tired women who approached each meal with an intensity that suggested they still didn't quite believe the food was real. He noticed how they ate slowly, savoring every bite, how they never left anything on their plates, how some of them seemed to be fighting the urge to pocket food for later. It reminded him of stories his grandfather had told about the lean years after the Civil War when nobody wasted anything because nobody knew when the next meal might come. Porter had grown up on a small farm outside Biloxi during the Depression, so he understood hunger, though not on the scale these women had experienced. His mother had stretched meals in ways that seemed magical, making a single chicken feed a family of 7. But even during the worst years, they had never gone truly hungry. There had always been something, even if it was just cornbread and buttermilk. Watching these German women react to basic American rations made him realize that his worst memories of scarcity were probably better than their best memories of abundance. He made a decision that bent the rules slightly, but felt right. During meal times, he began instructing the serving soldiers to give the German women slightly larger portions than regulation required. Not so much that it would be obvious to visiting inspectors, but enough to help them rebuild their strength. When one of his subordinates questioned the decision, Porter shut him down quickly. "They're prisoners, not animals. Geneva Convention says we feed them adequately. Look at them, Private. Does adequate seem like enough?" The private had looked at the thin women and said nothing more. Brunhilde was the first to notice the change. As a nurse, she had a practiced eye for portions and nutrition. The servings were getting larger, not dramatically, but consistently. She mentioned it to Irmgard one evening as they ate together. "The sergeant is giving us more food," she said quietly in German. "Have you noticed?" Irmgard had noticed. She had also noticed that Porter often stood watching them eat, his expression thoughtful, almost paternal. It reminded her of how her father used to watch the family at dinner, making sure everyone had enough before taking his own portion. One evening, Porter approached their table carrying a plate of leftover biscuits from the officers' mess. "These will just go to waste, he said, setting them down. "Might as well eat them." It was a thin excuse, and everyone knew it. Officers' leftovers didn't typically make their way to prisoner tables. But Adelheid reached for a biscuit with tears in her eyes and whispered in careful English, "Thank you, Sergeant." Porter nodded and walked away quickly, uncomfortable with gratitude for something that seemed so simple. He didn't think of himself as being particularly kind. He was just doing what seemed human and decent under the circumstances. November brought the first mail delivery for the German prisoners, letters that had been delayed for months while the women were in transit. The arrival of the mail created a strange mixture of excitement and dread in the compound. Irmgard received 3 letters, all from her mother, written over the span of several months. She sat on her bunk and opened the earliest one first, dated July of 1944. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, the letters formed with obvious effort. The message was brief and carefully worded, knowing that military censors would read every word. "My dearest Irma, we received word that you are a prisoner. I cannot tell you what relief this brings, knowing you are alive and safe. Margaret is managing as well as can be expected. The rations were cut again last month. We are surviving. Your father's sister has moved in with us, which helps with expenses. We think of you constantly and pray for your safe return. All my love, Mutti." Irmgard read the letter 3 times, translating the careful phrases into the reality they concealed. Rations cut again meant they were hungrier than before. Managing as well as can be expected meant Margareta was still sick. Surviving was such a low bar that it made Irmgard's chest ache. The second letter from August was shorter and more desperate in tone, despite the continued careful wording. The handwriting was even shakier. "Irma, we have heard nothing from your father since May. Pray he is well. The bombings have been worse lately. We spent 3 nights last week in the cellar. Margaret is very weak. The doctor says she needs rest and better food, but there is no more food to be had. Your aunt helps as much as she can. We dream of the day you come home. Mutti." Irmgard felt her stomach twist. Her father had been serving on the Eastern Front. The fact that there had been no word since May was not a good sign. The third letter, from late September, was barely a page long, and the handwriting was almost illegible. "My dear girl, I must tell you that your sister Margarete passed away on September 9th. She simply didn't have the strength anymore. She was peaceful at the end, sleeping. I am alone now. Your aunt returned to her own family. The apartment is too quiet. I keep your room exactly as you left it, waiting for the day you return. Food is very scarce now. I think of you and hope you are being treated well. Please write when you can. Mutti." The letter fell from Irmgard's hands. Margareta was dead. Her baby sister, who used to laugh and dance and dream about becoming a teacher, was dead. From hunger. From simple, preventable starvation. Brunhilde found her an hour later, still sitting motionless on her bunk, staring at nothing. 2 weeks after receiving the devastating news about Margaret, Irmgard moved through the camp like a ghost. She still worked in the kitchen with Corporal Nash, but the joy she had begun to find in the abundance had curdled into something bitter. Every egg she cracked, every portion she served, reminded her that her sister had died from lack of the very things that were treated so casually here. Brunhilde worried about her, recognizing the signs of complicated grief, the kind that came mixed with guilt and anger, and questions that had no good answers. On the morning of November 23rd, Nash began preparations for something he called Thanksgiving, explaining to Irmgard in simple English that it was an American holiday celebrating gratitude for abundance. The irony was so sharp, it almost made her laugh. He showed her the turkeys that would be roasted, at least a dozen massive birds, each one probably weighing more than her monthly ration back in Dresden. There would be stuffing made with real bread, not sawdust extended substitute, sweet potatoes with butter and brown sugar, green beans, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pies made with real cream and eggs. Porter had made an unusual decision. He had requested permission to include the German prisoners in the Thanksgiving meal, arguing that the holiday spirit of gratitude transcended national boundaries. His request had been approved with some reluctance by his superiors, who reminded him that there should be no fraternization beyond what was necessary for camp operations. But Porter felt strongly that breaking bread together might help heal some of the invisible wounds that war created. He had seen too much hatred already, and he was tired of it. On Thanksgiving Day, the mess hall was transformed. Nash and his kitchen crew had outdone themselves, creating a feast that would have been impressive even by peacetime standards. The German women entered nervously, unsure of what to expect. They had been told they would eat the same meal as the American soldiers, but none of them quite believed it until they saw the serving line. Adelheid stopped walking, causing the woman behind her to bump into her back. "Is this real?" she whispered in German. "Are we really allowed to eat this?" When it came time to serve the turkey, Nash carved thick slices of white meat, spooning stuffing and cranberry sauce onto plates without measure or hesitation. The deviled eggs were there too, Nash's signature dish, arranged on platters as they had been that first night. But this time, Irmgard didn't cry. She moved through the line mechanically, accepting the food that was offered, and found a seat at one of the long tables. Brunhilde sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. The meal was the finest either of them had ever seen. But for Irmgard, every bite tasted like ash. Her sister was dead, and she was feasting. The contradiction was unbearable, and she finally understood that abundance could be its own kind of cruelty. The days following Thanksgiving found Irmgard caught between two impossible emotional states. She was grateful for the food, for the relative safety, for the kindness shown by men like Sergeant Porter and Corporal Nash. But gratitude felt like betrayal when Margaret lay in a grave in Dresden, when her mother was slowly starving, when millions across Germany faced the same desperate hunger. At night, she wrote in a small notebook that Nash had given her, trying to make sense of feelings that seemed to contradict themselves with every sentence. "How can I be thankful for abundance while my sister died from scarcity?" she wrote in German, her handwriting tight and angry. "How can I accept kindness from enemies while my countrymen suffer? The Americans feed me better than my own government ever did, and this makes me angry in ways I cannot explain. I am angry at America for having so much. I am angry at Germany for having so little. I am angry at myself for being alive when Margaret is dead. Most of all, I am angry that I enjoy the food, that my body has begun to heal, that I sleep better now than I have in years." Brunhilde understood the conflict because she felt it too. Every prisoner in the compound carried the same contradictions. They had all received letters describing conditions that ranged from difficult to desperate. Some had lost family members to bombing raids or starvation. Others had simply lost contact entirely, not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. Yet here they were, eating 3 full meals a day, sleeping in warm barracks, wearing clean clothes. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. One evening, Adelheid approached Irmgard in the barracks with her own letter from home. Her husband, a soldier captured by the Soviets, was in a prisoner camp somewhere in Russia. Her 2 children were living with her parents in Berlin. "My mother writes that the children cry from hunger every night," Adelheid said, her voice hollow. "She is giving them her own rations, but it is not enough. My daughter is 7 years old and weighs less than she did at 5. And I am here, growing stronger, eating eggs and meat and bread. How is this fair? How am I supposed to live with this?" Irmgard had no answer because there was no answer. Fairness had nothing to do with their situation. They were prisoners in a country so wealthy that it could afford to feed even its enemies well, while their own family starved in a defeated nation that had gambled everything and lost. The guilt was crushing, made worse by the fact that their American captors seemed genuinely confused by their distress. Porter had noticed the change in mood among the prisoners, the way they had become more withdrawn after the mail delivery. He mentioned it to Nash one morning while inspecting the kitchen. "They got letters from home," Nash explained. "Sounds like things are pretty rough over there. Makes them feel bad about having it decent here." Porter nodded slowly. He had 2 sons somewhere in the Pacific, and he couldn't imagine what it would feel like to be well-fed while knowing they were suffering. Maybe these German women weren't so different from him after all. Corporal Nash noticed that Irmgard's grief had begun to transform into something more active. She worked harder in the kitchen with an intensity that went beyond simple diligence. One morning, as he was preparing to make soup from leftover roast chicken, she stopped him with a gesture. "May I show you something?" she asked in her improving English. Nash was curious enough to agree. What followed was a lesson in resourcefulness that would change how he thought about cooking forever. Irmgard took the chicken carcass that Nash had been about to dispose of and placed it in a large pot with water. She added vegetable scraps that would have gone to the compost, onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, things Americans routinely threw away. She explained in halting English how in Germany, nothing was wasted. Every part of every ingredient had value. The bones would simmer for hours, extracting every bit of flavor and nutrition. The resulting broth would be the base for multiple meals. Nash watched with growing fascination as she worked, realizing that he had been operating with an abundance mindset his entire life, never having to think about extracting maximum value from minimum resources. Over the following weeks, other German women joined the kitchen work detail, and each brought knowledge born from years of scarcity. Brunhilde showed them how to stretch eggs by adding small amounts of water to scrambled eggs, making them fluffier and extending the servings. Adelheid demonstrated how potato peels could be fried into crispy snacks instead of being discarded. Another woman named Crystal taught them to make bread last longer by storing it properly and using stale bread in dishes like bread pudding or stuffing rather than throwing it away. Nash began keeping a notebook of these techniques, writing down recipes that the German women remembered from their mothers and grandmothers. Kartoffelsuppe, a potato soup so simple and humble that it barely qualified as a recipe, yet when made correctly could be surprisingly satisfying. Apfelkuchen made with minimal butter and sugar, relying on the natural sweetness of apples and a hint of cinnamon. Sauerkraut prepared in massive batches because cabbage was one of the few vegetables that had remained relatively available in Germany. The exchange became reciprocal. Nash taught the women about cornbread, about the Southern cooking traditions he had learned from his grandmother in New Orleans, about the abundance of regional American cuisines. But he was learning more than he was teaching. These women had survived years of deprivation through creativity and resourcefulness. They had taken nearly nothing and made it into something nourishing. It was a different kind of skill than cooking with abundance, and Nash found himself respecting it deeply. Porter occasionally stopped by the kitchen during these sessions, watching as American soldiers and German prisoners worked side by side, sharing knowledge across a divide of language and former enmity. The kitchen had become a neutral space where the war felt distant and irrelevant. What mattered here was food, the universal human need that transcended nationality. He saw Irmgard smile occasionally now, usually when she was teaching something, and he was glad. The hollow look in her eyes had frightened him more than he wanted to admit. As December arrived and Christmas approached, the German women began discussing a plan that would require approval from Sergeant Porter. Irmgard was chosen as their spokesperson, both because her English had improved dramatically and because Porter seemed to trust her more than the others. She approached him one cold morning in early December, her breath visible in the Mississippi winter air. "Sergeant Porter, may I speak with you about important matter?" Porter gestured for her to continue, curious about what could make her look so serious. "The women, we have been talking," Irmgard began carefully. "Christmas is coming. In Germany, our families are very hungry. We thought perhaps we could save some of our food, small amounts from each meal, to send home as packages. We know it is an unusual request, but..." She trailed off, seeing Porter's expression shift from curiosity to concern. He understood immediately what she was asking, and his heart ached at the impossibility of it. There were regulations about prisoner communications, weight limits on packages, concerns about food spoilage during shipping, and most importantly, the simple reality that the mail system to Germany was completely disrupted by the ongoing war. "Miss Richter," he said gently, using the formal address he reserved for serious conversations, "I understand what you're asking, and I wish I could help, but there is no reliable way to get packages to Germany right now. The mail system barely works for letters, and food would spoil long before it arrived. Even if I got permission, which I probably couldn't, the packages would never make it." Irmgard had expected this answer, but hearing it still felt like a physical blow. She nodded slowly, trying to maintain her composure. "I understand, Sergeant. Thank you for explaining." That evening, the disappointment spread through the barracks like a disease. The women had built up hope around the idea of sending something home, of contributing in some small way to their family's survival. Now that hope was extinguished, and the approaching holiday felt hollow. Brunhilde sat on her bunk, staring at a letter from her mother that described the children's hollow-eyed hunger, and felt completely powerless. Adelheid wept quietly, trying to muffle the sound so as not to disturb others. But everyone was awake, lost in their own thoughts about the impossible distance between abundance and scarcity. Porter couldn't sleep that night either. He kept thinking about Irmgard's request, about the desperation behind it, about what it meant that these women wanted to go hungry again so their families might eat. The next morning, he called Nash into his office with an idea. "We can't send food packages," he said, "but we can write letters, official letters, on camp letterhead explaining that the prisoners are being well treated and adequately fed. Maybe that would give the families some peace of mind." Nash considered this. "We could also include photographs," he suggested. "Show them that their daughters and wives are healthy and safe. It's not food, but it's something." Spring of 1945 brought unseasonably warm weather to Mississippi and news from Europe that would fundamentally alter everything the German women understood about their country. The first reports came through American newspapers that circulated among the camp staff. Bergen-Belsen had been liberated by British forces on April 15th. The photographs were grainy and the descriptions were initially vague, but even the sanitized versions that appeared in newspapers conveyed something horrifying. Sergeant Porter read the reports with growing shock, trying to understand the scale of what was being described. The camp library, a small room with newspapers, magazines, and a few books, became the place where the German women confronted the truth about the Third Reich. Irmgard was there when the first detailed reports arrived, sitting in her usual chair by the window where the light was best for reading. She had been improving her English by reading American newspapers, finding the practice both educational and distracting. But the headline on this particular edition of the newspaper made her hands shake even before she understood all the words. "Nazi death camp discovered, thousands dead." The article described what British soldiers had found at Bergen-Belsen: mountains of unburied corpses, survivors so emaciated they barely looked human, evidence of systematic starvation, disease, and murder on a scale that seemed impossible to comprehend. The article was accompanied by photographs that Irmgard wished she could unsee. Bodies stacked like firewood, living skeletons staring at the camera with eyes that held no hope. British soldiers with handkerchiefs over their faces, overwhelmed by the smell of death. She read the article twice, then 3 times, hoping she was misunderstanding the English, hoping it was propaganda, hoping it was anything other than the truth. Brunhilde found her there an hour later, still staring at the newspaper. "Irma, what is it?" she asked in German, alarmed by her friend's pallor. Irmgard couldn't speak. She simply handed Brunhilde the newspaper and watched as the nurse read, as understanding dawned, and then horror, as Brunhilde's professional medical composure crumbled. "This cannot be real," Brunhilde whispered. "Our country would not. We would not do such things." But even as she said it, she knew it was denial speaking. The photographs were too detailed to be fabricated, the testimonies too specific to be invented. Other women gathered as word spread. The newspaper was passed from hand to hand, each woman reading with the same progression of emotions: disbelief, then denial, then dawning horror, then a kind of sick comprehension that their world had been built on lies. They had complained about rations while their government systematically starved others to death. They had worried about Allied bombing while their own country built factories of murder. Adelheid sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, repeating, "We didn't know," over and over like a prayer or a plea. Irmgard thought about the deviled eggs, about the abundance that had seemed so miraculous, about Porter's small kindnesses and Nash's generosity. The Americans had treated them with humanity, while their own country had apparently forgotten what humanity meant. The guilt she had felt about eating well while her family starved transformed into something much larger and more terrible. The days following the liberation of Bergen-Belsen passed in a fog of collective shock. More camps were discovered as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz had already been liberated by Soviet forces months earlier, but the full scope of what had happened there was only now becoming clear to the Western world. Each new revelation added weight to an already unbearable truth. The women gathered in the barracks each evening, speaking in hushed German, trying to process what their country had done, what they had unknowingly been part of. Irmgard stopped writing in her diary for weeks. What words could possibly be adequate? She had been complaining about hunger while others were being deliberately starved to death. She had mourned her sister's death from malnutrition while their government had been engineering mass starvation as policy. The moral scale of it was so overwhelming that individual grief felt almost selfish. Brunhilde, trained as a nurse to save lives, grappled with the knowledge that German medical professionals had participated in selections, in experiments, in systematic murder disguised as healthcare. Everything she had believed about her profession, about duty, about service, had been contaminated. Sergeant Porter watched the German women retreat into themselves and understood that something fundamental had broken. He called a meeting with his staff to discuss how to handle the situation. "These women are processing the fact that their country committed atrocities," he told his soldiers. "We need to give them space, but also watch for signs of despair. Some of them might become suicidal." Corporal Nash asked the question that several men were thinking. Should we show them sympathy? They're enemy prisoners. Their country did these things. Porter considered this carefully before responding. They're also people who are learning that everything they believed was a lie. That deserves some compassion, even from enemies. The question of complicity haunted the barracks. Had they known? Should they have known? Adelheid had worked in administration, processing paperwork for troop movements. Had any of those papers sent people to death camps? Crystal had been a radio operator transmitting messages in code. Had any of those messages coordinated the machinery of genocide? Irmgard had communicated orders from commanders to field units. Had she unknowingly been part of the chain of command that enabled mass murder? The not knowing was almost worse than knowing would have been. One evening, Brunhilde spoke what many were thinking. "We cannot claim innocence," she said in German to the gathered women. "We did not know the specific details, but we knew that Jewish families were disappearing. We knew about the camps, even if we told ourselves they were just labor camps. We knew, and we did not ask questions because we were afraid, or because we benefited from not knowing. That makes us complicit." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. She was right. Willful ignorance was its own kind of participation. Irmgard finally opened her diary again and wrote a single sentence. "I must remember everything about this place, everything about how enemies can choose to show humanity, because forgetting would be the final betrayal." The abundance at Camp Shelby wasn't just about food anymore. It was about the choice to treat prisoners with dignity despite having every reason for revenge. May 8, 1945 brought Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across America in celebration. In Camp Shelby, the American soldiers celebrated with subdued relief, knowing that while the war in Europe had ended, many of them would soon ship out to the Pacific Theater where fighting continued. For the German prisoners, the day brought no celebration, only uncertainty about what came next. Germany had been completely defeated, occupied by Allied forces, divided into zones of control. The country they had known no longer existed. Sergeant Porter received orders regarding repatriation procedures. The female prisoners would be processed for return to Germany, likely within the next 2 to 3 months. The logistics were complicated by the chaos in Europe. Transportation was limited, ports were overwhelmed, and the displaced persons crisis was unprecedented in scale. Millions of people were trying to get home or find new homes. The German women would join that massive flow of humanity eventually, but there was no rush. They were housed, fed, and not causing any problems. The announcement of eventual repatriation created complex emotions among the prisoners. Relief that they would see their families again if their families had survived. Dread about what they would find when they returned. Germany was in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, its economy destroyed, its people starving. The letters they received painted increasingly desperate pictures. Irmgard's mother wrote that she had been forced to leave their apartment in Dresden, which had been largely destroyed in the February bombing raids. She was now living with distant relatives in a village outside the city, sleeping in a barn and working for food. "I don't know if I will still be here when you return," she wrote, "but I pray every day that you will come home safely." Brunhilde received news that her husband had died in a Soviet prisoner camp. Her children were still with her parents in Berlin, now under Soviet occupation. Getting to them would mean crossing into the Soviet zone, navigating bureaucracies that had no reason to help a former enemy. Adelheid learned that her apartment building in Berlin no longer existed, destroyed in bombing. Her parents and children had relocated to her uncle's farm in Bavaria, now in the American occupation zone. At least she knew where they were, which was more than many of the women could say. The prospect of returning to such devastation was overwhelming, yet staying in America was impossible. They were prisoners of war, not immigrants. Once the repatriation process began, they would be required to return whether they wanted to or not. But the time they had spent at Camp Shelby had changed them in ways that would make returning difficult beyond just the physical circumstances. They had seen an alternative way of living, a society where abundance rather than scarcity was the default, where former enemies could be treated with dignity. Irmgard struggled with conflicting feelings about leaving. Part of her desperately wanted to find her mother, to help her survive, to rebuild something from the ruins of their life. But another part of her had begun to imagine a different future, one where she didn't have to return to a country stained by unforgivable crimes. She kept these thoughts to herself, knowing they sounded like betrayal. What kind of daughter would rather stay with enemies than return to help her mother? June arrived with humid Mississippi heat that the German women found oppressive after years in cooler climates. The repatriation date had been set for mid-July, giving them 6 more weeks at Camp Shelby. Irmgard found herself wanting to document her time there, to have physical proof of what she had experienced. She approached Sergeant Porter with an unusual request. The camp had a camera used for official documentation. Could she possibly have a photograph taken? Porter was curious about what she wanted photographed, expecting perhaps a portrait or a group photo of the prisoners. "The deviled eggs," Irmgard explained in her now fluent English. "I would like a photograph of the deviled eggs on a platter, the way Corporal Nash makes them." Porter blinked in surprise. Of all the things she could have wanted to remember about America, she wanted a picture of deviled eggs? But then he thought about that first night, when the women had wept at the sight of them, and he understood. It wasn't really about the eggs, it was about what they represented. He agreed immediately and arranged for the camp photographer to come to the kitchen. Corporal Nash prepared a platter exactly as he had that first evening. Dozens of deviled eggs arranged in perfect rows, the yolks whipped to creamy perfection, each topped with a sprinkle of paprika. He placed the platter on a clean white tablecloth and stepped back. The photographer, a young private named Miller, set up his camera and took several shots from different angles, making sure the lighting captured the detail. Irmgard stood watching, memorizing every aspect of the scene. She wanted to remember the abundance, the casual generosity, the simple fact that such a display of eggs could exist. When the photographs were developed a week later, Porter gave Irmgard 3 copies. She studied them intently, these small black and white images that somehow contained everything important about her time in captivity. "My mother won't believe this is real," she told Porter. "She will think it is propaganda or that I am lying. How can I explain to her that our enemies fed us better than our own country ever did?" Porter had no good answer. The truth was so contradictory to German propaganda that it would sound like fiction. Brunhilde asked for copies of the photograph as well, wanting to send one to her children in Berlin. "So they know that I was safe," she explained. "So they understand that not all enemies are cruel." Adelheid wanted a copy to keep, something tangible to prove that this strange interlude had really happened. The photograph began circulating among the prisoners. each woman seeing something different in it. Some saw abundance and kindness. Others saw the contrast with their family's suffering. A few saw evidence of American wealth that had enabled their country's defeat. Irmgard wrote on the back of her photograph in careful English, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, June 1945. This is what abundance looks like. This is what it means to be treated with humanity, even by enemies. I must never forget. She placed it carefully between the pages of her diary, protecting it for a future that suddenly seemed important to document. Someday, she thought, people would need to know that even in war, even between enemies, kindness was possible. The final week at Camp Shelby arrived with surprising emotional weight. The women had been prisoners, technically enemies, yet the approaching departure felt like leaving a strange kind of home. The routines that had once seemed foreign were now familiar. The faces of American soldiers who had been guards were now friends, or something close to it. Irmgard realized she would miss Corporal Nash's morning greetings, Sergeant Porter's gruff kindness, even Private Miller's terrible jokes that she had learned to understand and appreciate. Nash organized a farewell dinner that would be the last time the prisoners and their captors ate together. He spent 3 days preparing, wanting it to be memorable. The menu included all the foods that had become significant over the past 9 months. Deviled eggs, of course, arranged on platters, as they had been that first night. Roasted chicken with the crispy skin that Adelheid loved. Fresh bread that still seemed miraculous to women who had eaten sawdust extended substitutes for years. Even a cake, which Nash had baked himself using real butter, real sugar, real eggs, without any substitution or rationing. The mess hall was decorated simply but thoughtfully. Small American flags on some tables, acknowledging the victory and the soldiers' service. But there was also something unexpected. Corporal Nash had found small sprigs of evergreen and placed them in simple jars on each table, a nod to the German tradition of bringing greenery indoors. It was a small gesture, but it acknowledged that the German women had their own traditions worth respecting. When Brunhilde saw it, she cried quietly, touched by the thoughtfulness. The meal began formally, with Porter giving a brief speech thanking the women for their cooperation and wishing them safe journeys home. But the formality couldn't last. These people had spent nearly a year together, had shared meals and work, and gradually had learned to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The conversations flowed in mixed English and German, with much laughter at miscommunications and inside jokes that had developed over months. Private Miller attempted to sing a German song he had learned, murdering the pronunciation so badly that even he laughed at himself. Irmgard stood to speak, her English now confident enough for this moment. "When we arrived here, we were afraid," she began. "We had been taught that Americans were cruel, that we would be treated badly. Instead, you showed us kindness. You fed us when you had no reason to care if we went hungry. You treated us like people, not like enemies. This is something we will carry with us always. When we return to Germany and people ask about our time as prisoners, we will tell them the truth, that we were treated with more humanity by our enemies than by our own government." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Several American soldiers looked uncomfortable, not knowing how to respond to such earnestness. Sergeant Porter finally stood, clearing his throat. "You came here as enemies," he said simply. "You leave as something else. I'm not sure what to call it, but it's not enemies anymore." It was perhaps the most eloquent thing Porter had ever said, and it captured exactly what everyone was feeling. The categories of enemy and friend had become inadequate to describe what they had become to each other. The transport ship that carried Irmgard and 31 other women back to Europe departed from New York Harbor on July 18, 1945. The journey took 12 days, and with each day the reality of what they were returning to became more concrete and more terrifying. The ship was crowded with repatriating prisoners, displaced persons, and refugees, all heading toward an uncertain future in a destroyed continent. The food on the ship was adequate but basic, already a step down from what they had experienced at Camp Shelby. Irmgard noticed how quickly she and the other women returned to their old habits, eating slowly, saving portions, never wasting even a crumb. They landed at Bremerhaven, which barely resembled a functioning port. The infrastructure had been bombed repeatedly, and what remained was operating at minimal capacity. Processing through the displaced persons camp took 3 days of waiting in lines, answering questions, having documents checked and rechecked. The camp provided thin soup and hard bread twice a day, portions that would have seemed impossible to survive on just a year ago. Now, after months of American abundance, Irmgard felt the hunger returning like an old, familiar ghost. Her stomach cramped. Her energy flagged. She remembered viscerally what chronic hunger felt like. Brunhilde was separated from their group, being sent to Berlin through different channels because it was under Soviet control. Their goodbye was brief and painful. 2 women who had survived something together, now facing different, uncertain futures. "Find your children," Irmgard told her. "Hold them tight. Tell them their mother never stopped fighting to get back to them." Brunhilde embraced her fiercely, whispering in German, "Remember the kindness. Pass it on somehow. Don't let it die with us." Then she was gone, joining a different line of displaced persons heading east. The journey from Bremerhaven to what remained of Dresden took 2 weeks, traveling in overcrowded trains that barely functioned, walking when no transportation was available, sleeping in ruins and makeshift shelters. Irmgard saw the devastation of Germany with new eyes, having spent months in a place where buildings stood intact and infrastructure worked. Entire cities were rubble, bridges were destroyed, fields were scarred by battle. Everywhere she looked, she saw hunger. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs, old people who looked like walking skeletons, women who would have been her age but looked decades older, worn down by years of scarcity and fear. She reached the village where her mother was living on August 5th. The reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. Helena Richter had aged terribly in the 2 years since Irmgard had last seen her. She was gaunt, her hair completely gray, her hands shaking with the tremor of malnutrition. They held each other and wept, grief and relief mixing together. That night, sharing a small room in the barn where her mother slept, Helena asked about her time as a prisoner. Irmgard carefully pulled out the photograph of the deviled eggs, now creased and worn from travel. Her mother stared at it for a long time in the dim candlelight. "This is real?" she finally asked. "They really fed you like this?" Irmgard nodded, and her mother began to cry. Summer of 1965. The kitchen in Irmgard Henderson's home in suburban Chicago smelled of boiling eggs and vinegar. Her daughter, 12-year-old Margaret, named after the aunt she would never meet, sat at the kitchen table watching her mother work. Irmgard had been an American citizen for 15 years now, having immigrated in 1950 after years of rebuilding in Germany. She had married Thomas Henderson, an engineer she met through a church group that sponsored displaced persons. They had built a comfortable life, the kind of middle-class American existence that still sometimes felt surreal to Irmgard. "Mom, why do you always make so many deviled eggs?" Margaret asked, watching her mother prepare what must have been 3 dozen eggs. "We're only having the Johnsons over for dinner. That's like 6 people total." Irmgard paused in her work, looking at the eggs she had arranged on the platter, and realized it was time to tell her daughter the story. Not the simple version she usually shared, but the real story, the complicated truth about hunger and abundance, and what it meant to be shown kindness by enemies. She sat down across from Margaret and began to speak. She told her about Dresden, about Aunt Margaret dying from starvation, about being captured and transported to Mississippi. She described that first night at Camp Shelby when she had seen more food than she had seen in years. She explained how Corporal Nash had made deviled eggs, dozens of them, and how she had cried because such abundance seemed impossible. Margaret listened with wide eyes, struggling to imagine her competent, calm mother as a starving prisoner of war. Irmgard pulled out a small wooden recipe box that she kept in a cabinet, one that Margaret had seen many times, but never really examined. Inside were recipe cards, but also photographs, letters, and other memorabilia. She found the photograph of the deviled egg platter, now yellowed with age, and showed it to her daughter. "This is what changed everything for me," she said softly. "Not just the food, but what it represented. The Americans who ran that camp chose to treat us with humanity when they had every reason to hate us. They fed us abundantly when they could have given us just enough to survive." She explained how Sergeant Porter had allowed extra portions, how Nash had taught her to cook with abundance instead of scarcity, how these men had shown her that enemies could choose to be something else. After the war, when I learned what Germany had done, what we had been part of, I felt like I didn't deserve the kindness I had been shown, Irmgard continued. But Sergeant Porter told me something before I left Camp Shelby. He said that kindness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to be human even when it would be easier not to be. Margaret touched the old photograph gently, seeing it with new understanding. "Is that why you always make extra?" she asked. "Because you remember when there wasn't enough?" Irmgard nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I make extra because I can, because abundance is a gift that should be shared, because I want you to grow up knowing that there is enough, that we don't have to hoard or fear scarcity." She squeezed her daughter's hand. "And because every time I make deviled eggs, I remember that even in the darkest times, people can choose kindness over cruelty, generosity over revenge."